we're now going to look at how to individualise conditioning programs for hockey players, both on an individual level and when we're working with groups. And also within the section, there are some free training guides and calculators that do all the hard work for you. So, for example, the anaerobic speed reserve calculator and mass conditioning calculator have all been built to do all the work for you in terms of prescribing running distances or training times. So all you really need to get your kind of head around in this section is just purely what the conditioning requirements are. And obviously we've covered that in the initial section around physical demands, but we're going to go a little bit deeper into the conditioning requirements and then a couple of options of how you assess it, how you individualize it, and then you can basically make an informed decision based on your individual context. So in terms of what we mean by this term conditioning, ultimately we mean preparing the body for the aerobic and anaerobic demands of the sport. So every sport has a unique set of requirements, and in hockey there is a very clear aerobic demand and there's also a high anaerobic demand. So we have to optimize conditioning preparation for athletes in order to meet the needs of both. And there are a few things I will be talking about within this section, one of which is how we create what's called a locomotor profile. And this is a way for us to determine what type of running profile an athlete has. So we'll be covering that within this section. We'll also be looking at maximum aerobic speed, anaerobic speed reserve, and how we can use the 30-15 intermittent fitness test as a means of assessing hockey-specific fitness as well. So as a quick recap on the running demands, three kind of key areas that stand out: total distances, the high-speed running requirements, and the repeat sprint bouts that are involved. So in terms of total distances, again, just recapping from section 2, for women's hockey, we're looking at around a ballpark of 5 to 7 kilometres. For men's hockey, this is international and national levels. For both, we are looking around the 6 to 9 kilometre sort of category. High-speed running distances then are around the 5 to 600 metre ballpark for women, 1.6 to 2.3 kilometres in men. The differences, again, are so obvious in the high-speed running section because, again, we take that from an absolute number, which is typically 5 metres per second or 18 kilometres per hour. So it doesn't equate relative speeds for the two different games. So that's kind of why the differences are there. And again, if there was a relative percentage that was used, it would probably equate out quite neatly there. The repeat sprint bouts requirements then are typically 4 bouts with 15 seconds recovery per bout, which characterises hockey. So as you can see, we need to be able to cover lots of distances, be able to tolerate high running demands in successive games, and then also be able to perform these repeat sprint bouts during things like change of direction, high-speed accelerations, and counterattacks, that kind of work, with very short turnarounds. So it's a real hybrid sport. There's lots going on here. There's lots of things we need to prepare for. So now we're going to try and get clarity on how do we actually go about preparing for these in terms of assessing the physical capabilities of the athlete in relation to these sporting demands so that the program can bridge the gap closer towards these demands and an athlete can hopefully get themselves in a position where they're able to tolerate these demands much more effectively and excel on the field. So the problem, as we've sort of mentioned in previous sections around principles, is that there's a lack of individualization when not prescribing from an assessment of running ability. So in other words, if we're not assessing, we're guessing, as we've already mentioned, and there is just not enough precision of measurement when we're not using the assessment to inform the decision-making process. So fundamentally, we have to make sure that we're assessing the running capabilities of an athlete and of a squad of athletes if we're working with teams in order to more accurately prescribe running conditioning interval work to more optimally prepare athletes for the demands of competition. So in terms of the advantages of assessing in general, as we've mentioned, you can individualize training. So you can individualize training intensities to make the responses to training more equitable across different players. So if you've got a squad of 20 players, if you're just giving them all the same session to do, all the same distances to try and aim for, some people are going to be working incredibly hard and some people are going to be having a very easy time. So we have to make sure that we're giving individualized percentages. And there are a few ways we can do that, which we're going to go into in this section. You can monitor progress more accurately because if you're not kind of using this level of precision, it's also harder to track, is someone actually getting better, which is fundamentally what we're trying to do. And it ensures appropriate training volumes and loads for the individual. So the loading on the athlete is going to be appropriate when we give them an intensity that is related to their underlying assessment, and the type of session that we're doing is helping to solve this specific performance problem that we've identified. So that limiter to performance, the physical limitation to performance that we've mentioned already. So these are the real kind of key bits about assessing. So there's a couple of key definitions. Don't worry too much about these. You can always go back and look at them again if there are new bits here, or if there's information that is a little overwhelming to begin with. You can take your time working through this content because there's a fair chunk of this to get through. But in effect, you need to worry about 4 key terms when we're talking about conditioning. One is maximal sprint speed, which is just the maximal velocity an athlete is capable of running at, and that's typically measured in meters per second. So, for example, an athlete can run 10 meters in 1 second, then you would achieve 10 meters per second, which would be quick. Velocity in the intermittent fitness test is the name for the score that is achieved in the 30-15 intermittent fitness test. Again, there'll be a video specifically on the 30-15, but in effect, the score you achieve is in kilometers per hour, and that's what you call the VIFT score. So the abbreviations will be used throughout the section. So if you see any of these 4 abbreviations, these are the things we're referring to. Anaerobic speed reserve then is the difference between the fastest speed that an athlete can possibly achieve and their maximal aerobic speed score. So for example, if an athlete has got a maximal aerobic speed score of 4 meters per second and a maximal sprint speed of 9 meters per second, their anaerobic speed reserve is 5 meters per second. And for reasons that we'll go into later, there are many benefits to having a larger anaerobic speed reserve. Maximal aerobic speed then is the lowest speed at which VO2 max occurs, and we'll be looking at that in a lot more detail. But in effect, the higher this is, the more you can tolerate high intensity work. It is related to things like total distances achieved. The higher the playing level, the higher the score needs to be. And so this is a very, very important measure. So if we just visualize that, this is what the different definitions there look like visually represented. So if we have athlete A and athlete B here, you can see this blue bracket is the anaerobic speed reserve. So starting from 0 meters per second up to 10 meters per second, athlete A sitting at around this sort of 4.5 meters per second, and that is their maximal aerobic speed. That should say MAS here. And then their maximal sprint speed is around 9 meters per second. So they have a anaerobic speed reserve score here of around 4.5 again. So 4.5 plus 4.5 gets you to 9. And the VIFT score is likely going to sit around this sort of ballpark. It's going to be a score sitting within the anaerobic speed reserve. So there are going to be sort of intersections and overlapping elements here. But in effect, the VIFT score should sit within the anaerobic speed reserve because it's intermittent in nature, and so we're going to be going faster than we possibly could do if we're running in a continuous nature, as you do with a maximal aerobic speed score. If you take these two athletes side by side, and we know that 5 meters per second is your high speed running sort of threshold typically, then athlete A here is working at a very small percentage of the anaerobic speed reserve running at 5 meters per second. As you can see here, it's very, very small. Whereas athlete B over here, because their sort of speed ceiling here is lower and this is lower, the relative percentage of work anaerobically is a lot higher. So athlete B is going to have to work harder, and it's going to be more physiologically taxing on their body to run at these sorts of high speeds. Knowing what we know about the physical demands of hockey, there's a very high speed running component and repeat sprint component. So if these two athletes, all else being equal, were to compete in a match, it would be likely athlete A would be in a much better position physically to tolerate those sorts of demands, and athlete B would probably fatigue quite a lot faster. So when it comes to options of how we go about assessing and prescribing, we really have sort of two options which we can use. One is a little bit more accurate in terms of prescription and is a little bit more physiologically set up, if you like. It's a lot more kind of, you can more accurately prescribe from it physiologically. The other, 16 pitch lengths and a 30 to 40 meter sprint time, are a little bit less accurate in terms of the physiological responses you might see, but are a little bit more easy in terms of logistics. So there's this trade-off really between what you're optimizing for. Are you optimizing for physiology or optimizing for logistics? And for many reasons, clubs, schools, athletes with not huge amounts of resource may find it easy to go with option one and just do a 16 pitch lengths run because it requires no equipment, you can do it from anywhere, and then just time themselves in a flying 10 meter sprint. However, teams with a bigger resource, time and that kind of thing could potentially look at using a 30-15. So there'll be two separate videos to this which will go into those two in a lot more depth. So if we just recap on individualization, individualization is important because it aligns the training program with the needs of the individual, it avoids overtraining, boosts motivation, and increases the chance of achieving goals. So it's really important that we look at, once we've assessed, we've got a baseline measure, and then from that information we can provide a highly specific individual training program overall that's going to enable an athlete to get to a position where they can tolerate the physical demands of hockey much more effectively. One way we can do this is based around Sanford's work, and he essentially came up with these three kind of key profiles. One's called a speed profile, one's called a hybrid profile, and one is called an endurance profile. And the speed profile is essentially a fast twitch dominant athlete with a relatively low mass score and a high maximal sprint speed score. This means that they have a pretty large anaerobic speed reserve. So their speed ceiling is high, but their mass score is low. So they've got a big anaerobic speed reserve, as we showed on the graph earlier, how that might sort of look overall. And they're suited to shorter, more intensive conditioning sessions because they are much more geared towards having this sort of profile. So typically, forwards and attacking midfielders are probably going to have this sort of profile because they are typically faster, typically more game-based around speed, and they're a little bit more fast twitch. So you're probably able to perform lots of high-intensity bouts, have a big impact, but then might fade off if they're doing longer stints on the pitch. So maybe they're probably suited to shorter rotations, so they can have a shorter but more immediate impact. A hybrid profile sits in the middle. It's the blend of the two, of speed and endurance. They typically have a moderate mass score and a moderate maximal sprint speed score. So they suit a sort of mixture of both. And typically sort of positions like in the midfield, that kind of thing, are going to suit this because they've got a nice sort of balanced overall profile of, good speeds overall and a good sort of mass score. And then lastly, the endurance profile is slow twitch dominant. So they've got a very high mass score, but a pretty low maximal speed score. So this means they've got a small ASR and are more suited to what we call extensive conditioning sessions. So things like 3 to 4 minute interval work is going to suit their slow twitch profile a little bit more effectively. One sort of side note on this as well, not only is this better physiologically because you're suiting the physiological kind of makeup of the individual athlete, but also you are suiting their psychology as well and buy-in from an athlete, because if an athlete sees that what they're doing is aligned with their preferences, their natural tendencies, and that they're maximizing their strengths, then they're going to be really bought in and more likely to perform the sessions. So rather than trying to make a speed profile, do a 4-minute interval work, or an endurance profile, trying to do repeat sprint work, you give them the types of sessions that are more sort of aligned with their physiology and also their overall athletic makeup. So if we then visually just represent this, we have 3 different profiles: a speed, hybrid, and endurance profile. And again, we're looking at the blue bar there, that's your anaerobic speed reserve. So a speed athlete is going to have a pretty low mass score here. The dark blue bar, but a very, very high maximal sprint speed score, as they've got a huge anaerobic speed reserve to tap into. Hybrid is a bit in the middle. They've got a moderate mass score and a moderate maximal speed score. And then the endurance profile's got a high mass score but a low maximal sprint speed score. So if in a one-off race, the speed profile will win because they can achieve a higher speed. So if they're racing over 50 meters, for example, this athlete is going to win because they are much, much quicker. In a game where lots of repeated 5 meters per second efforts are required, then potentially something like a hybrid profile would do pretty well because they have got a nicely balanced mix of speed and endurance, and so the relative percentage that they're working at to achieve that is probably overall the smallest. Maybe the endurance profile would be in line with that as well, but a speed profile is going to be able to perform these sorts of actions well, but again they'll fade because their aerobic capacity to compete and complete these over and over again becomes diminished over time, whereas these two come into their own the longer the efforts become. So centre backs, for example, are more likely to have an endurance profile, forwards more likely to have a speed profile. So some example sessions that you might be able to do with these different speed profiles. A forward, for example, or a speed profile might be doing things like 10 seconds on, 10 seconds off at something like 120% of the maximum aerobic speed score, or 25 to 50% of the anaerobic speed reserve. Tempo conditioning sessions, which are based around maximal speeds over a distance and typically pitch length efforts doing that. Or sprint intervals, which are things like 5-second all-out sprints with 30 seconds recovery. So very much speed and repeat speed focused efforts. A hybrid profile in the middle is going to do something like a mixture of both, so short intervals, long intervals, tempo intervals, so 30s, 2 minutes, and tempo conditioning. And then your more endurance profile is going to be suited to that longer aerobic efforts because they've got that capacity and slow twitch profile by design. So things like 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off, 800 meter intervals, 1K repeats, 6 minutes on, 2 minutes off, that kind of thing will suit their profile a little bit more. So that gives you some ideas of how you can match, again, the training prescription to the individual. Touching again on the hierarchy of need approach, however, there's a few ways in which we can help to make effective decisions, and this model is one of them. If we utilize this approach, we recognize that repeatability is the top of the tree, if you like, the most important thing, but it isn't important until the lower rungs of the ladder are dealt with first. So, for example, if the maximum aerobic speed score that we've established as a benchmark isn't being met, so if we take a speed profile and their top speed is really good, but their maximum aerobic speed is really poor, then it's important to get that right first in order to achieve repeatability later, because it's going to be a limiting factor for their ability to perform repeated bouts of work, multiple games in a week, and their injury profile, or injury risk if you like, will potentially be higher if the maximal aerobic speed score is severely hindered. So to make this individualised and taking that approach, if you had an example of, say, a forward with a high maximal sprint speed score but a relatively low maximal aerobic speed score, we could do short aerobic intervals which would match their profile but boost their maximum aerobic speed score by working above maximum aerobic speed in order to get them to the standard required before then starting to work more on their repeatability overall. If, however, we've got, say, a hybrid profile, someone who's got a really good maximum aerobic speed score already, but at the next rung up the ladder, their maximal sprint speed is now the limiting factor, we can then really attack that. And then once that's in place, we can look at the other limiting factors to repeat sprintability. So taking that approach is helpful for a few reasons. It just gives clarity of outcome, it makes things individual, and it ensures that what's important, first and foremost, maximum aerobic speed, is in place first. Now, there's a couple of ways in which we can just look to go through a sort of decision-making hierarchy, if you like. So what this is if you have one athlete you're trying to make a decision for, this is a simple means by which you can make an informed decision around what their program will look like. So step one is an assessment, And this is where we complete a relevant assessment to determine the athlete's capability in relation to sporting demand. So we're going to pick, because we haven't got the capacity to do a 30-15 test, a 16 pitch lengths run, and a maximal sprint speed score of a flying 10 metre sprint speed score between that 30 to 40 metre split time. Next step is limiting factors. We then identify what the limiting factor to performance is. And in this case, we'll say that their maximum aerobic speed score hasn't met the standard that we're looking for at that point in time. Let's say we're looking for something like a 4.4 meters per second and this athlete's only hitting 4.2. Then the limiting factor is this, because their maximal speed is very, very good. So this could be a classic case of a speed profile. In which case, we then need to work out what is the intensity as measured by running speed that we need to be running at in these conditioning sessions in order to create the necessary adaptation. The adaptation we want is improved maximum aerobic speed score, and the limiting factor is maximum aerobic speed, not maximal sprint speed overall. The intensity in order to improve on maximum aerobic speed is speed above maximum aerobic speed. So we know we have to be working above 100% of maximum aerobic speed. And if that's the case, ideally we need to be basing that on the percentage of the anaerobic speed reserve, because it becomes more accurate that way. So maybe we've decided that we're going to run at 25% of anaerobic speed reserve in these sessions and do a 10 to 15 second interval session. Volume, determine the volumes of training required to elicit adaptations required. If it's a period where you don't have a lot of hockey on, then we can obviously bump the volume up. If you've got lots of hockey volume on at that period, you can reduce the overall volume down a little bit. Next step, principles. Which training principles are needed to ensure the outcome is met? Well, individualization, the overload principle, because overload is required in order to push someone beyond their physiological state and that habitual level at which they're used to. So the intensity is going to be one of those driving factors that helps to provide overload in terms of running volume and overall demand. Method, which method will be the easiest to achieve the intended outcome? Probably going to use some short aerobic intervals based on maximum aerobic speed, because it's the simplest method, which provides overload, matches the speed profile, and leads to the intended outcome of increasing maximum aerobic speed. Prescription, we're then going to allocate the specific training sets, reps, and rest that we needed. So in this case, we're trying to achieve high volume in the off season with a speed profile with short aerobic intervals. We might be doing something like 3 sets of 15 repetitions of 10 seconds on, 10 seconds off with 5 minutes recovery in between. And the intensity we're going to be running at is 120% of maximum aerobic speed. And then after we've done a period of work, we can reassess to decide, has the intended outcome been met, or does the program need to be modified? And when we choose to reassess is based on adaptation profiles and timelines. So pretty typically, if an athlete is trying to improve maximum aerobic speed, then at least 8 weeks is probably going to be an appropriate timeline. So this sort of decision tree hopefully has helped to give you an overview of, if you've got one athlete trying to make a decision, you can hone in on what's limiting them, how is it limiting them, which session is most appropriate, what training principles and outcomes you're trying to meet, and then how can you assess to determine if you've made the impact or not. But what if there's a team of athletes? And this is now a decision tree based on high numbers. Let's say you've got a whole squad and it becomes pretty hard to go through that process for 25 athletes, every single week or every single training block. Instead, you can base this on a decision tree like this. So the first question on the decision tree would be, has the mass benchmark been achieved? This is like an inverted hierarchy of need now. So we're looking at the first rung of the ladder. Has the benchmark been achieved? If the answer is no, then we're going to continue focusing on mass until that's achieved. And that is like the example from the previous slide, where the speed profile athlete just needs to improve on that mass score. And you could almost use the other sort of set of questions to then determine how you're going to go about improving that. But if we're just thinking about high numbers here, then maybe using a simplified decision tree like this would be more useful. If the answer is yes, though, then obviously we can start to worry about repeat sprintability, and we can start to look at all of those limiting factors. And again, what is actually limiting that? So if the RSA standard has been achieved, and figuratively, let's say that is a 6.5 second initial sprint speed time over a 20 meter shuttle, and a total time of X, or an average of say 7.5, then you can allocate more training resource and time to other training areas now. So, rather than putting all the time into the physical aspects, it might be you've got more time allocated to the technical aspects because there's a technical limitation to performance. So you've always got to make sure you're putting the right time and resources into the right areas. Or if it hasn't, after that stage, then you focus on the limiting factor to this. So is it maximal sprint speed score? Is it lactate buffering? Is it change of direction? All of these things are informed by the repeat sprint ability test. And so you can begin to actually look at which are the limiting factors there and how can we go about improving on them. So a couple of references here for this section, which you can have a little look through here. The key things from this initial section are that individualization is massively important, and simplifying a process of getting there is also key. So I hope that's given you some ideas of how you can individualize training based on assessment and how that is aligned with the requirements of the sport overall. In this section then there's a little task for you, and that is to create a conditioning plan for 2 sessions that meets the needs of the hockey player. So I'm going to give you a couple of case study examples, and then there's going to be an example based on your context where you just need to kind of create 2 sessions. So one mass-based session and one 30-15 based session. And then finally, in the next section, so in the final sort of taught section, we're going to be looking at planning and periodization, the particular sort of focus overall on the principles by which we can program effectively. So this is going to tie in everything we've covered so far to look at how do we plan out a training year, the month and the week, and how can we use heuristics or rules of thumb to make our life a lot easier when it comes to making effective decisions around programming.